Hey everybody, it's Chris again. Today is going to be a little bit different. Usually you see me standing beside an appliance, but today we're going to be talking about snowblowers. So we've got a bit of an old but good machine here that a customer dropped off to us to have a look at it before he buys it. Um, you never know with secondhand stuff whether you're really getting a good deal or not. So today we're going to just be talking about snowblowers, general maintenance. We're going to do a little maintenance on this one. And if you have any snowblower questions, throw them our way. And as well, if you are one of our regulars and you know that we also do appliance questions, feel free to throw any appliance questions you may have our way as well. So let's get into talking about snowblower.
We already have a question
Oh, good.
from Xander on YouTube asking, how does the snowblower work?
Well,
Guess we'll start with the basics.
Yeah, perfect. So this is a fairly basic snowblower, so it's a good way to talk about the subject. So basically, we've got an 8 horsepower gas engine that's designed to run 2 drive belts. One that's going to run the transmission for the auger, and the other one is going to run the drive mechanism. So they're 2 independent operations that the engine runs. So again, one is the drive mechanism that allows the machine under your control. They have it drive itself forward and backwards. And then the other system is for blowing the snow, which is the impeller that actually does the throwing of the snow, as well as driving the augers that pulls the snow in. So together, that engine creates 2 functions. And this machine actually is a beautiful little machine. It's an 8 horsepower. It's a 26-inch opening, which is ideal because this engine is rated for the size of the opening. It's really hard to overwork this. This is an older model with the Tecumseh engine, and when it came to snowblower motors, these things were just the top notch. You don't see Tecumseh on new machines anymore, but in their time, they were just the best engine you could ever imagine. Very few troubles. As long as you kept good gas in them. That's the same for any gas engine product. Make sure you've got good, clean, fresh gas. You don't want to have any condensation or water in there, or you're going to get a gummed up carburetor. So this one actually runs, as you know, it actually started, ran pretty well. So whoever owned it before did a pretty good job of making sure that it kept the carburetor clean and using good gas. Now, we're going to go through some basics as far as oil changing and looking at belts and stuff like that. This one's fairly plain Jane. There's no electric starter on here, although one could be added. We may do that for the customer at some point in time. But all in all, it drives well. It blows snow pretty good. Now, other machines you'll find have electric heated grips. This one doesn't have it. So it is just a bare bones machine, but it looks like it's going to do the job pretty well. So let's talk about the engine a little bit. Again, it's an 8 horsepower Tecumseh. It's a carbureted model, pretty trouble-free. Other than doing your oil changes, and we're going to do an oil change today on this one, because when I took a look at the dipstick in it, it's actually pretty dark. So I don't think it's had the oil change for a little while. The only downside to this particular machine is it looks like the previous owner just left it outside and not covered. As you can see, the bucket is pretty rusted up, and the oil is there's good oil in it, but it's pretty black. So it's obviously got a bunch of moisture at some point that's turned that oil, or it's not going to change on a regular basis. So we're going to change that up. Now, I don't know what sort of oil was put in this, and by that I don't mean the weight. Typically snowblowers are 5W30, but I don't know if it was synthetic or just regular SAE oil. So we're going to drain that out, and we're going to replace it with 5W30 that is actually synthetic. A little bit more expensive for the oil, but I like synthetic very much. It lasts longer. It's certainly more well suited for a snowblower, where it's going to be sitting in the shed probably for the summer, and then in the winter it's got to go back in the cold. So synthetic doesn't break down over time the way SAE 30 oil does. So spend a little bit more money, but it's a better machine. Makes for a better machine. Okay, so I'm just going to get my drain pan. Pretty easy, cheap little drain pan. And The drain on this one is here in the back. And I've got the engine already warmed up so it'll drain well. So these guys were good enough that they extended where the drain plug is at the base of the engine. So you can easily change your oil. At one point, they didn't have these extensions, so when you went to change the oil, half the time it just ran down all over the side of the frame and just made a horrible mess. You'll see how dark this oil is when it comes out. There you go, look at that, just about like tar.
Delicious.
Yeah. So it's certainly due for an oil change. So what? Just let that drain out. Talk about some of the other features of it. On these engines, we have a throttle. We have a choke. You just want to make sure that that's all moving smoothly. On these, as well as the throttle, they have the setup is so up the top is full speed. As you move down, it slows down. And when you get to the very bottom, it'll actually shut the engine off. It has a grounding wire that breaks the ignition circuit. And on these ones, they used to be known for a problem where the key went. So that's the key. So they had a problem with the key on them. The little tab that has the wire that this key is separating it from the frame would come loose and it would just dangle inside. So you'd be out blowing snow and then all of a sudden your engine would be starting to die out like it was running out of gas or the choke was on. And then all of a sudden it would start running great again. And you could waste a lot of time messing around trying to figure out what's going on with carburetor and fuel when actually it was just this little key switch that moved out of place. So when these older Tecumsehs, you used to pull these covers off. In fact, we'll pull this one off and you can see where that switch is. So pretty well any snowblower you buy has a cutoff key so that you can pull that out so kids can't start it, or gives you a little protection from anybody trying to start it when they shouldn't. So if it's got a key, there's going to be a little switch in there that grounds out the ignition circuit. So we'll just show you that so you can be aware of it and know that if you're starting to experience that, that is something that's really good to check.
We have another question from YouTube that seems relevant.
Okay.
So it is a 96 Ariens,
Yep.
runs rough, but does run.
Okay.
What should they do for it now so that, like, for spring tune-up before they put it into storage?
Well, if it's running rough, before you put it in storage, it's probably a good time to address that. So obviously it runs, it's just not running smoothly. So either there's a little bit of dirt in the carburetor, or may even just need a carburetor adjustment. A lot of carburetors on these older models, you'd be able to adjust the high speed and low speed on the carburetor itself. The older Ariens, you could do that as well. Some of the newer ones, you only have one adjustment. That's your low speed, which is really just an air screw. But I'd be looking at some point just taking the bowl off the bottom of your carburetor and making sure that there's nothing in there, no dirt. And you'll see if there is any dirt, it'll be sitting there at the bowl. And you may need to eat that carburetor clean. So ideally, you want to address that before you put it away. The other thing that'll sometimes happen that they run rough is your gas cap. And it sounds kind of funny to think about a gas cap being a problem, but these gas caps are vented. So even though the ceiling keeps the gas out, they're allowing the air into the tank. Well, sometimes that vented gas cap will plug up. You'll get a spider web, speck of dirt, whatever that gets in there, blocks that vent. When it does, it creates, as the fuel level starts to go down while the engine's running, the tank basically airlocks. And that prevents the fuel from continuing down to the carburetor. So you'll wind up with the engine kind of cutting out and dying. And usually what will happen is, just as they're about to die, it'll suck a little air, and then it'll be enough to get the fuel moving again. So if you're finding that it's working good, and then suddenly running rough, and then working good again and running rough, look at your gas cap. It could very well be the problem.
Do you have another question from our YouTube viewer?
Yeah.
Curtis is asking, is it better to use seafoam in the mix or use premium fuel?
Well, on older ones, they were designed not to run on Supreme, but I think you'll find your newer style, your newer engines, they're going to recommend in the manual to use Supreme. And if that's the case, then follow the recommended by the manufacturer. So if they say use Supreme, do so. It's actually better for the engine, and it actually gives you more horsepower. So if they're recommending using Supreme, use that. You'll see a difference.
So whatever the manual says.
Whatever the manual says is the idea. The guys that built these engines are designed to work with a certain kind of fuel. And different types of fuel will affect the temperature of the engine, so it is important to use what they recommend, even if the good stuff is expensive. And as we all know, it's getting more expensive, but the amount of fuel that you use in your blower, the amount of times you typically use it, a few extra dollars, it's worth the investment. There's a carburetor. So there's that key switch I was talking about. So the newer ones are designed a little different, but it's the same principle. Basically, the plastic key is going in and it's simply pushing that little wire out of the way so it's not making contact with the frame. So when you pull your key and that touches, that grounds out your ignition system and shuts the machine off. But what happens with these sometimes is that little plastic piece is just pushed in to the bracket and it's melted. Well, over time, sometimes that little flange of plastic will wear off. So this switch will drop out of place. And then it starts floating in here and it just starts falling over and touching the side. And every time it touches, it tries to cut the engine out. So if you've got that happening, but you don't think it's your fuel system or your carburetor, take a look at that. And all we used to do to them, instead of making the investment for a new one, we just take a little tie strap, put around it, pull it tight, cut the tab off, and you'd be good to go.
So the tie strap's not going to melt either?
Nope.
Nice.
Nope, tie strap will work just fine. So that's just one of those quirky things that happens. But with that cover off, you can now see your carburetor. If you need to do any maintenance to it, it's ideal to have that out of the way. This one has adjustment high-speed jet on the bottom. And there's the screw up here is your low speed, or basically it's an air screw. So anytime you go to make an adjustment on these, you just want to do a very small amount of rotations, because on these, a quarter of a turn can make a huge difference in airflow. So you just want to make your adjustments slowly. And if you look in your owner's manual, they typically will give you the basic settings as to where those screws should be. Usually they tell you to turn the screw all the way in and then back it out either 1.5 or 3/4 of a turn to get you at a good starting spot for your carburetor. Now these guys typically have, excuse me, because they're being designed to work in cold temperatures, they need a lot of raw fuel for when they start up in the cold. So they typically have a primer. And this is just basically your primer bulb here. And when you do that, it's simply pushing air. And it's pushing air through this little hose here into the throat of the carburetor. So it's basically taking some pressure and it's putting air pressure in the bowl. So it's taking gas and it's forcing it down so it goes up into the throttle tube and it gives it a good, rich mixture. To the point, if you pump that enough, you'll sometimes notice gas dripping out the back onto the snow. So if that's the case, you know your primer is working. So that gives you a good good heavy fuel mixture for a cold start. And then once they're up and running, you typically don't have to touch the primer anymore.
We've got a question from our TikTok audience. Are electric snow blowers able to handle the same workload as gas ones?
That's a fantastic question. And we're starting to see a real transition now from gas to electric. And the folks that are making, well, there's two types of electric. There's electric with an electrical cord, but the big change you're seeing now is going into battery. So I guess the best way to answer it is they will do a great job as far as power wise. There's a couple things you have to consider. You're going to need a really powerful electric motor. Electric motors have a ton of torque. There's no problem with them running to a speed to turn the impeller fast enough to throw snow. Some of them throw snow just as far or further than the gas powered ones. The biggest challenge you have with anything that's battery powered is how long can I run it for? So you want to look at battery capacity if you're looking at buying one to see how long it'll last. And keep in mind, when you're in the cold, the capacity of the battery is reduced by about a third. So looking at the amount of space you need to clear snow and how much snow you typically get in your area, whether you typically just get dustings or a couple inches, or if you're getting dumped on a regular basis, it may not be the machine for you. You also have to consider how long and it's going to be running to clear your area, because the batteries do only have a certain amount of life before they go to drain. Now, gas powered, runs out of gas, you add more gas, you're good to go. If you've got cordless, then you either have to have spare batteries for when yours drain out, or you have to prepare to stop, bring them in, charge them, and go back out and finish the work. But I've seen some of the electric ones in use, and yeah, they can throw snow just fine. I'm not so sure that what's out there today can really meet anybody in a commercial operation, anybody who's out doing driveways for other customers. You would need a lot of batteries in order to, try and run a business with them as they stand right now. But for the homeowner with a smaller driveway that doesn't get, a ton of heavy wet snow, yeah, I wouldn't hesitate to go with electric. And they're pretty maintenance free. I mean, there's a controller, an electric motor, and some drive stuff similar to a gas one. But as far as the components, you don't have carburetors to worry about. You don't have chokes. You don't have primer bulbs. There's a lot of positive points to it, and they're quieter, which is not always a bad thing, especially if your house is close to the neighbors. You don't always like it when you're up at 6 a.m. clearing snow.
Unless you do their driveway too.
Unless you do their driveway too, exactly. And I usually wind up having to do that.
All right. If anyone else has snowblower questions, pop them in the chat. We'll keep answering them.
Yeah, for sure. So the other thing I like to look at with snowblower is look at the pull cord. Now this one looks like it's been replaced at some point in time. The original one would have not had any color, it would have just been a white cord, and it would have been thicker. So this has been changed at some point. But honestly, it's not really long enough. It does retract fine and everything, but you can only give it a good short pull. So you may find that if you've got one that's a little bit hard to start, you're going to be a little bit annoyed at having a short cord, because when you go to really give it a pull on a hard pull and be able to pull as much as you can to get that engine spinning, a shorter cord just doesn't do it and gets a little frustrating. But I wouldn't change this one yet. If it breaks at some point, I would suggest putting a new cord on it. The other thing I'd want to look at is spark plug. Spark plugs, some people change them every year. I used to work with a company where we did maintenance programs where we changed the spark plug every year. And honestly, doing so was more just a nice marketing strategy. It kind of gave the customer that nice, warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that their spark plug was changed. But if you think of the spark plug that's in your car, how many miles you drive before you change those plugs? How many times that spark plug has been made ignite? It's a lot of times. And then compared to the amount of hours you put on your snowblower to season. So On my own personally, I don't change my spark plug every year unless I've had a really tough year. But I'll look at doing maybe every 2 years. And again, it depends on how many hours you're putting on your blower each winter, how hard it's working, and as well, for the price of a spark plug, it's not the end of the world. So if it does give you some peace of mind knowing you've got a new spark plug each year, then by all means go for it. Now, I just pulled the plug on this one, and I had it running for about 5 minutes or so. And I don't know what kind of conditions it was used in previous to arriving here. But if you look at the color of that spark plug is pretty sooty. And ideally, you'd like to see a spark plug with the center electrode down inside there, which is normally white when it's brand new. In fact, I'll show you a brand new plug. You can see how the insulator is just a nice
Little, there we go.
There we
We're
go.
working with 2 cameras here, folks.
Perfect. Sarah keeps me on track here. So yeah, you can see the new one, the pretty white insulator compared to this one that's black and sooty. A nice, properly running engine, properly running temperature. That should be a little sooty and more of a tan color. So this one's been running a little bit rich, which means a bit too much fuel. So it was running good to get today. Might wind up looking at making a little adjustment to that carburetor just to suit it, but we are going to be putting the new plug in it. So they're pretty easy to change. The only thing you want to do is make sure you gap the plug to what this engine requires. These just come in a box. Yep. These just come in a box, and if they're beat around much, then that little gap may not be where it should be for this engine.
Which guy am I looking for?
The 0.30. The thickest one pretty much to the backside there. Yeah. So why do I want to gap my spark plug? And how do I know what gap to do it at? Your owner's manual will have that information. And if you don't have your owner's manual, you can always get it online. But for this machine, for this engine, they recommend around 0.30. So I just have a feeler gauge that is that. And you just want to set your feeler gauge between the electrode and the little piece on it, and you need to be able to just have it slide in and slide through without being stuck tight. The reason the gap is important is when this ignites and that spark shoots across the electrode, it wants to have a good, sharp spark to it. If it's too far, then the spark gets weak. Makes it harder to ignite that fuel mixture. And if you think about snowblower, where it's starting in a cold environment, cold, heavy air, and a bunch of raw fuel on it, you want to have the best possible spark in order to have that be a one pull only start. So if you get a new spark plug, check to make sure the gap is okay. It may be fine out of the box, but it's worth taking the extra second with a feeler gauge just to check and make sure it's at the right gap. And if so, then it's just a matter of threading it back in. Nice and tight. Good time to inspect the ignition wire cap. Make sure it's not cracked or split. If it is, then you'll want to get a new one, because that's actually going to start leaking some electricity out of it. You'll lose some of your spark. It may actually ground itself out onto the metal frame, and the machine won't start at all. So if this is not in good condition, you'll want to change your coil. It comes with this lead on it, and make sure that when you push it on, you can tell it's actually gripping the plug. You can hear it and you can feel it. So you want to make sure you get a good tight connection like this one is. And then you'll have good ignition, you'll have good spark, you'll have easy starting. And yeah, it's pretty frustrating when you're standing out there in the cold, yanking your arm off trying to get one of these things to go. So little things like properly gapped, good spark plug, good fuel, properly adjusted carburetor, and these monsters will start right up and go like the wind. Alrighty, so I've got that oil drained out. I'm just gonna put the cap back on.
So what does one do with the old oil now? Where do we have to take this?
Well, in our area, we can take it to any gas station that does oil changes, and they'll accept it. Other areas, you have to go to like an environment center in order to turn it back in. And in other areas, there's garages which use old waste oil for doing undercoating and stuff like that. So just, it's not hard to find in your local area. You can, if you're not sure, you can check with any garage and they'll give you some direction as to where you can get rid of your waste oil. It's just, you know, the last thing you want to be doing is dumping it somewhere on your own or somebody else's property. That's just not cool. And I spilled a little, which I always do, no matter how hard I try. I'll just give that a wipe out. Before I put the fresh oil in, I'm just going to pull my belt cover off and inspect the belts. And then I'm going to actually access the bottom panel so we can see what the drivetrain looks like as far as the friction wheel and the bearings for the axles and the drive system.
Where's the best spot for our viewers to be?
You see this?
Yeah,
Right where you're at.
we'll stay put then.
Okay. There's our drive system. I mentioned earlier, pretty well most blowers have two belts. The front one closest to the impeller and auger is your auger belt. The one in the back is your drive belt. That's what's used to drive the wheels, and it's always closer to the engine. Now, if you've got a Honda or a Yamaha, some of their newer ones that have a hydro drive transmission, you're not going to have that extra belt. If you do, it's not running directly to a pulley such a maybe going down and running your hydraulic pump for your drive system. But you want to take a look at your belt tension. Take a look at your belt. Now this one is an MTD, and they tend to use a cogged belt. This one's a little gummy. It's a little slippery. And that shouldn't be, that's going to slide on us. Pop that off so we can see it. The belt's in pretty good condition as far as not being torn or ripped. Snowblower belts are designed specifically for the snowblower. In other words, you can find a belt that's the same length. Say you've broken or your belt's worn out and you're just running down to the local garage and say, hey, I need a belt this width and this length. You can put it on and it'll fit, but it probably won't work right. It'll engage, but when you release your lever for your impeller and your augers to stop, a lot of times they keep running. And that's because they don't have the exact proper pitch and material that a snowblower belt does. Because these belts are designed that when the pressure and tension comes off them, that they'll slip in the pulley. That way, when you release it, take your hand off, the little brake that's on them can stop that impeller really quickly. If you don't have a snowblower belt, good chance it's going to stick in the groove and it's going to continue to drive, and now you've got a safety issue you have to be concerned about. If you're used to using a snowblower and you don't abuse the blower by pushing it too hard into too much snow, these auger belts will last a long time. And there is adjustments on your tensioning pulley where you can adjust for normal stretch and wear. But again, a good working machine that you know how to use and you don't overwork it, that belt will last you for years. Drive belts don't typically need replacing on a super regular basis. They typically last a pretty long time because on these are basically running continually when the engine's running, and they're just running the pulley for the input for the drive system. So some of the questions come up as to how am I supposed to blow snow? In other words, how do I know if I'm overworking it? Well, the thing about blowing snow, in this one, you've got a 26-inch wide opening, and that's almost 18, 20 inches high. Your first cut of snow when you go to do your driveway, you don't have an option. It's going to take a full bucket's width, and it's probably going to work pretty hard, especially if the snow is a bit wet at all. But once you've got that first swath cut, ideally every swath you take after that, if you want to prolong the life of the machine and not be replacing belts on a regular basis, you should be looking at either taking half or 3/4 of the bucket size on your next passes. That does a couple of things. One, the machine's not working as hard, less strain on the drive and the auger components and belts, but it also stops that snow from being pushed out that it can't quite handle, so that you're not winding up with that ridge of snow all the way down the length you've just traveled, which means you got to come back again and do another swath just to pick up that little bit. So after 3/4 of your bucket on each swath after, and your machine will last a long time without you having to do major repairs. Talking about our augers, on this machine, again, some of it's not been cared for the way it should be. This one's actually bent because it should be in straight line with this other one. So it's obviously picked up a rock or they picked up something they shouldn't. Used to be the Christmas catalog that would be thrown out at the end of your driveway when it was delivered on a snowy day and you didn't know it was there, or the newspaper. But these ones are actually nice and free on their shafts. MTD does a pretty good job on the way they mount them. They have a sleeve bushing inside, so they don't tend to rust. Some of the Noma built ones, they had grease fittings, so you had to grease them, and that bit of grease would leave them so they would float. So if you needed to take them off, you could get them off. A lot of people didn't grease them. So if you did have a problem, you needed to take your auger assembly out and take your augers off, you couldn't get them off without either using a torch or beating and smashing a lot of stuff. So if yours has grease fittings, make sure that's something you do every season. Make sure you got them well greased. These ones are nice and free, so that's good. I also inspect the gearbox to make sure that I don't have any lubricant leaking out from them. So there's a gasket in here, and this one's nice and dry. There's also an oil seal here in the back. Now, so again, just using your finger, if it's coming out nice and dry, then the seal is good. If you're coming out with a lot of grease on your finger, then that seal is starting to go. So if the lubricant can get out, moisture can get in, and you'll start to cause premature wear of your gearbox. Now this bucket's in pretty bad shape. You see the paint's coming off it. It's obviously done some hard work. It's kind of bent up in places. So it's done a fair bit of hard work. So probably when he's done using it, I'll get him to bring it into me, and we'll strip it down, take it apart. We'll clean all our rust off, get it cleaned up, and then repaint it so that, one, it looks a little better, but the main thing is to keep that keeping usable and not rusting and falling apart. The buckets are fairly expensive, but for the little bit of time it takes to strip them out and paint them, it's a worthwhile investment. So let's take a look from the underside and look at our drivetrain, see what kind of shape it's in. So Sarah, I'm going to set this guy right up.
Come around the other side then?
Yeah.
Alrighty.
Now these machines are really great for doing service on because you can tip them right up. The only thing you have to watch, if you've got a really full gas tank and you stand this on its nose, some of that gas is going to leak out of that vented cap. So you can take the cap off and you can do a couple of things. I usually take a plastic bag.
I don't think we have anything handy.
I found a growing out. You made it. I don't think there's enough gas in this one for it to be a problem. Anyway, yeah, it is. So I just take a Ziploc bag. Tight the cap in. And that'll seal it up pretty well. Again, I don't think there's enough gas in this one to leak out the vent anyway, but that makes a difference. Now the gasoline will melt the plastic over time. So you only have, if the tank's full, it is going to start to leak. But for the amount of time we're going to have this up on its nose, that won't be a problem. So if you have a full tank and you need to stand your machine up, you're going to have to drain that gas out. There we go. So now we just got the bottom pan to take off. So there's our whole drive mechanism. So it doesn't look too bad in here. And actually, somebody's done some maintenance. I can see there's a bunch of grease on the spring. Now, these don't come greased from the factory. They're just a regular style spring, and they have whatever coating they have on them when they're new. But over time, especially with snowblowers, they'll start to look like this one. Now, it's interesting that was coated and this one isn't. So yeah, over time, these springs will rust and, they'll just break. So when you look at what their purpose is, this spring is used for one of the idler pulleys to, when you release the handle, it pulls the arm back to release the belt. This one is being used for the drive system. So it's really neat how the drive system works on these. Your engine is turning through the belt, it's turning this pulley. So this disc actually spinning. So with that spinning, when you pull your drive lever, it's making that disc come up and touch this friction wheel, thus engaging your drive wheels. And the really cool thing is when you shift gears, it's simply moving that friction disc on a different part of that drive disc. So the further out you are in the disc, the faster your wheels are going to turn. The closer to the center, the slower it goes. And when you go right the other way, it actually reverses the direction. And that's how they get a variable speed forward and backwards with this system. And you think about how hard these machines will pull in the snow, and it's all because of this rubber wheel pressing down on this rotating disc. So if you're going to have any part that's a wear part on your drive system, it'll be this friction disc. So if you push your blower too hard into the snow, this is where the strain's all taking place. It's right at that contact point. And you'll know if you pull your bottom cover off and you look at your friction disc, this one's in really, really good shape. But if you're seeing pieces missing or cracks and splits in it, then you have to start thinking about replacing it, because it will get to a point where you lose your drive. It'll catch, it'll grab, it'll slip, and you'll just get really frustrated and you won't be able to get all the blowing done the way you want to. So that's how you know, that's how it works, and that's how you can inspect your friction disc to make sure it's in good shape like this one is. The other thing you want to look at is just making sure this shaft is nice and clean. And I don't mean clean like, spotless. Like this has a coating of grease on it, which is great. That's what allows that shifter to travel so smoothly. A machine that's not maintained, this will get dried right out. The snow and the water that's in there will wash that lubricant off. And this shaft will start to rust. And when it rusts and corrodes, you'll notice it because this gets a little harder to slide, and sometimes it won't slide at all, especially when you bring it out into the winter, out of the being stowed away for the whole summer season. If that starts to corrode, then that stops working. So you wind up having to either replace that shaft or spend a lot of time trying to sand it down, get it clean, get it lubricated. And the other thing that'll wear on these, it's just a normal wear tear item, is this friction wheel is variable separately. So if the rubber disc goes, you can replace the rubber disc. But this assembly that it rides on has a set of bearings. And over time, through normal wear and tear, you may have to replace this if this bearing goes bad. It just winds up being really stiff. It'll be really noisy. And that's kind of the key, that you need to change that.
While we have a good view of the rusty bucket here, one of the YouTube viewers was asking what you would actually do to clean up the rust.
Great question. What we'll do with this one is we'll have a wire brush. Because of the extent and the size, I'll take and put a wire wheel on a drill or a disc grinder, and I'll strip all this off. Get rid of the old paint, get this rust gone until I'm down to bare, shiny metal again. And then I'll give it a spray with a primer that's designed to work against rust, and completely do the whole entire bucket, and then I'll repaint. One this bad, I'll probably actually give it a coat of rock guard. For anybody that's, has trucks and you rock guard your rocker panels and your wheel wells because of all the grit your big tires throw up on them and stuff, or you see truck beds that have that rubberized finish, that's a type of rock guard as well. So this one's bad enough that I'll probably, after I clean the paint off and get her sanded down, I'll give it a coat of rock guard, and then I'll paint it just for looks over the rock guard because it's just black. So that's going to seal that metal up again, and it's going to give it a lot of protection from the next number of years of snow and wet. While we got it up, this piece here where the bolts are, this is your scraper blade. These bolts are pretty rusty, so they will probably snap off when we try to remove them. But your scraper blade is adjustable. And this is something you have to set depending on the type of driveway you have. If you have a paved driveway, then you can set it up so that scraper blade is just barely skimming your pavement, or it's just a hair's width or the thickness of paper above it, so you can clean your driveway really well. If you've got a gravel driveway, that's going to be a little different. You may need to adjust your scraper bar up a bit so you're not digging into that gravel, especially on your first snowfall in the winter. Usually the ground may not be completely frozen, and these just wind up digging in. You're picking up all that gravel, and then it's going through your machine and pounding the pieces out of this housing. Same with your skids. Now somebody's put newer skids, so the other ones must have been obviously pretty bad shape. I don't think these are actually the right ones for this machine, but they're on there, so we'll see, or we'll replace them if he wants it done. But you want to get your skids adjusted so that the bucket's not actually sitting on the ground. Gives you a little bit of clearance. And again, if you've got a gravel driveway, you can set your height with your skids so that you're going to be up off of your gravel. It does mean you wind up with a little bit more snow being left in the driveway, but if you're on gravel, you don't have much choice. So if these are rotted off, and they're a normal wear item, they'll get pretty rough, pretty jagged, and eventually they'll just sort of disappear. So now you're starting to ride down on your bucket instead of the skid. And I think this one probably has been looking at the condition of that. So that's something to look at, is your skids, your scraper bar. Your scraper bar has been set up right from the beginning. You'll probably never have to change it in your use unless your blower's used more months than the average, or you're getting more snow. But skids are something that you normally have to replace. The other thing I want to look at is just my drive axle, my gears. Now this one's a little noisy, and I don't think it's bearings. And that's one of the things you can check as well. Your axle bearings, you can just take the wheel and move them. Now you see there's a little bit of play, but that is not a difference in, it's not a wear in the bearing between the axle shaft and the bearing's not worn. It's just the way the bearing fits into the housing. There's a little bit of play there. So that's not bad. I'm not worried about that. In conditions where it's getting a whole lot of use and there's a chance of some gravel or dirt being mixed in with your snow, or a lot of salt content, it will get into those bearings and it'll wear them a little sooner than you'd like to see them. So that kind of brings up another point. When I would do regular maintenance on snow blowers, I would always pull the wheels off. I'd take the bolt out. Some of them bolt on the end like the MTDs. Some of them have a shear bolt that goes through to hold them on. But I would pull these wheels and I would grease these shafts so that if you ever had to service your gearbox assembly, you can get those wheels off when you need to. If you don't do that, some of these will weld right onto the shaft. So you have really no choice but to cut that axle and then take your wheel somewhere where you can maybe press that shaft over the wheel. In some cases, you wind up having to actually replace the wheels. So if you're doing your maintenance in the fall or in the spring, I prefer to do mine in the fall. That way I know it's all ready to go for me for the winter. But yeah, I'll pull these wheels off and grease those shafts. But this one's in actually pretty good shape, so that's good. The other thing you can do is just move one wheel ahead and one wheel back, and that'll tell you if your wheels are free on your axles. If they're frozen or rusted on there, then when I move this one's going to move too. So these are nice and free. So this is actually in pretty good shape for the age and obviously the amount of use that it's had. So I'm going to pop it back down on its wheels. I'll put the cover back on another time. So the other thing that tends to wear on snow blowers, if you want to check, we talked about the auger pulley. I'm sorry, the auger belt. The other thing you want to look at, if you can get at it, this machine's a little snug, but your auger belt goes on the auger pulley. That's the guy down in here. Might be a little hard to see. So there's my auger pulley. So what I like to do is just reach in. I'll take a little tension off the brake, and I'll just grab this auger pulley and see if I can move that auger shaft up and down. So what I'm doing is basically pulling the pulley up and down. There shouldn't be any play in there. If there is, if you're able to feel that pulley move up and down, and it'll almost make a clunk clunk as it does it. If you have that kind of play in there, then that auger shaft bearing is worn out, and you'll want to look at replacing that. So the sooner you replace it, the more you stand a much better chance of getting it off the impeller shaft. If you leave it go to the bearing, really gets beat up and overheated. It's really, really hard to get them off. So that's just something to check. If you're finding you're getting noise when you're blowing snow, like the impeller's actually hitting the housing and there's no rocks or anything in there, that's causing that scraping, then you may want to look at that auger bearing. It may be worn enough that when you engage it and pulls the belt tight, it's pulling that auger pulley up, making the shaft come up, making the impeller getting even closer to this housing. So if you're getting a scraping noise when you're engaging your auger, it's probably that bearing. So that's pretty well the things I would typically check. When I'm doing my maintenance, I'm going to put some lubrication on my chute control so that it'll turn nice and smooth and freely. A plastic chute or a metal chute, I'm either going to put a coating of car wax on the inside. If I don't have the car wax, the other thing I typically will use will be spray silicone. Spray silicone is a little expensive, so I tend to do the car wax thing. But I basically spray a coating on there because if you're in an area where you get a lot of heavy wet snow, it'll tend to clog down in that chute. If you apply that coating of wax or silicone, the snow won't stick to it, even though it's really heavy wet stuff, and you'll find it'll just discharge much further and much easier. Saves a lot of strain on the machine and saves the frustration of having to stop and waste your time trying to clear your housing. So a little bit of wax, or like I say, silicone spray works great. And you may have to do it a few times a season. But again, it makes the snow travel much further, much faster, and makes it much easier on your machine. Tires, another thing I'll check is I'll just want to have, they recommend somewhere between 15 and 20 pounds in your snowblower tires. So check them when you get started in your season, and then when the cold hits, check them again, and you can do it even just by standing on your tire and making sure it's good and firm. If it's not, at some point when you go to make a turn, especially a tight turn where this one's not a steerable drive, so the tires tend to drag, they'll actually pull the tire away from the rim. And most of these don't have tubes in them. So now you're trying to deal with getting your tire into a position where you can actually get it to hold air and get it pumped up again. So a little bit of time, check your tire pressure, get them pumped up nice and hard to about 20 pounds, and you won't have any problems.
Okay. So what's our grand summary of all the things to check? It's taken us about an hour to go through the whole machine here?
About an hour is what I would typically take if I was doing the maintenance. So I'm going to want to make sure I change my oil, inspect the spark plug. I'm going to want to check and my belts, make sure they're in good condition and adjusted up properly. I'm going to want to make sure my augers are free and clear. Make sure my tires are fully pressurized so they're good. I want to check my start cord to make sure it's not frayed or going to break on me. And even if you have an electric starter, it's still worth the time to check this. If you've been using your electric start, this probably isn't worn, so that's great, but you want to be sure your starter is going to work. And one of the things I tend to find, and I would always tell my customers, if you use your electric starter all the time, that's great. That electric motor will whirl that engine over, and even with a bit of a carburetor problem, it'll start. But if you want to take at the beginning of the season and know that your engine's ready to go and it's going to start when you need it to, start it with the pull cord. It should, once you primed it, get your choke on and your throttle up, these engines should start up with just one quick pull. If it's taken 2 pulls, that's okay. If it's taken 3 and 4, there's a problem there that you'll want to address. Because eventually, whatever that problem is going to get worse enough that even with the electric starter, it's not going to start for you.
And I guess we drained the oil, so we can't do a demonstration now, right? We haven't changed.
Well,
we drained it, but haven't changed it.
Yeah, I haven't put the oil back in it. But yeah, I mean, there's still enough lubrication, so yeah, you just want to be able to give it a big pull. And it should start on the first pull. So that's the basics. If you do that kind of maintenance on your machine every year, it's going to be there for a year. Snowblowers last a long time if you maintain them properly and you use them properly.
Perfect. If anyone has any final snowblower questions, pop them in the chat. But otherwise, we will wrap up here and see you in a couple weeks' time.
All right. Thanks very much for watching. And yeah, if you have any questions, appliances or lawn and garden equipment, yard work stuff, just, send them off to us and we'll do our best to answer them. We'll probably be doing some more outdoor power equipment here in the near future. So we'll try and help you with any questions you may have. Or if you've got any real good stories that you've experienced with your equipment, you want to pass it along to everybody, put it in comments as well. We'd love to read them. So thanks very much. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.